Welcome to the final component of our democracy and security seminar series, which has been invented and chaired by our own Claudia Lopez. Today's topic is tackling state capacity amidst insecurity and inequality challenges. I just want to say, first of all, I want to thank Claudia Lopez for inspiring and organizing and running this seminar. And to say again that I really, it's hard to think of a more important topic right now in Latin America than thinking about ways of handling security in a democratic context. So many, many thanks to Claudia, and many thanks to all of you, including our wonderful panelists, for joining us today. With that, I'm going to pass the baton to our fearless leader and listen and learn.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for everybody who's connecting online and here in the room, to our dearest participants. Today, we have the honor to have three terrific participants in the panel. William Maloney is Chief Economist for the Latin American and the Caribbean region of the World Bank. Previously, he was Chief Economist for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions, and Trade and Competitiveness. He was also Global Lead on Innovation and Productivity. Prior to the bank, he was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and then lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for Latin America until 2009. Bill Maloney received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, has a BA from Harvard University, and he studied at the University of Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and has published extensively in academic journals and many other international finance, development, country labor markets, innovation and growth, among other topics. Our second panelist is Hillel Soifer. Hillel is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. His empirical work has mainly been centered in Latin America, where he works on state building and other elements of political development. His 2015 book, State Building in Latin America, of Cambridge University Press, explains variation in state building outcomes across Spanish America, with a focus on the development of education, taxation, and conscription in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru in the period of 1850 to 1920. In addition to a series of related articles of the historical development of the Latin American state, he has also published widely on the conceptualization and measurement of state capacity. This constitutes his work investigating both historical trajectories of state development and related issues in the contemporary Latin American context. Thank you so much, Hillel, for being here with us today. And finally, our third panelist is Ken Eaton, who is Distinguished Professor of Politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research examines the interplay between policy and territory, focusing on the territorial reorganization of states in the world today. His work explores how territorial interests and identities impact political outcomes, including democracy, development, and security, and how political conflict in turn shapes the logic of territorial institutions. Specializing in comparative politics, Professor Eaton's current projects include the design and performance of federal institutions, the causes and consequences of decentralization, and the formation and evolution of movements for territorial autonomy. So thank you, really. As you could see, we have three terrific participants in today's panel, which, by the way, is not going to be the last panel of our series. We are planning a fifth and last panel, probably focus on issues around justice, not only formal provision of justice, but also informal mechanisms of provision of justice in Latin America. We will make an announcement later on about that. So just keep on attending this, because there will be another session. But today is quite important because we've discussed the challenges of Latin America regarding the provision of security, the challenge of violence across rural and urban Latin America from different perspectives. The reorganization of police departments, the challenges of organized crime, the way they regulate markets, economy, territory. We discussed this from the perspective of the challenges to deal with populist caudillos in the region. And today we're going to discuss it from the challenges of state building. Maybe in the root of the deficit of state building processes, state capacity, and also on the roots of inequality in the region are part of the challenges and responses that we need to tackle to improve security. So that's sort of the perspective that we're gonna discuss today. So probably Bill, wanna go first?
Sure. Thanks very much for the introduction, and it's a privilege to be among such distinguished people working on this topic. My guess is none of us have the answer to this, so you'll have to bear with the looseness of some of my thoughts. By being an economist, I'm necessarily going to be a little more technocratic and focused, I think, but I hope it all fits together. So the topic was covering a lot of ground, so I put as a omnibus title, Citizen Discontent, Crime and Violence, and State Capacity. See where I actually wind up in the end. Just wanted to start saying what we all know, which is that Latin Americans are grumpy. And crime and violence is both a cause and a result of that. We know that crime and violence has really high costs in well-being and in growth. More recent studies, for instance, in Colombia, when the peace process looked like it was going to take hold, we saw a big spike in investment, and then when it didn't seem as promising, investment fell back. Little increasingly well-documented episodes such as that one let us know very clearly that security is key to growth, and certainly people feel it. The rise in crime and violence is putting additional demands on an already pretty unpopular democratic state. See over here from Latino Barometro, a percentage of citizens who believe that the country is governed for the benefit of a few. And the numbers seem extremely high to me. I mean, when you're getting even to reasonably well-run countries like Costa Rica and Chile, we're above 90%. But how much stock we put in that, it almost certainly isn't the reverse. People are unhappy. And support for democracy is falling across time. Using the same source, going from 99 to 2010, 95 to 2010, about 60% said, hey, democracy is the right form of government for us. In the last 5 years, it's fallen to 50%. And part of that, I do believe, is due to the rise in especially organized crime, but just general insecurity. The other thing is that what happened in the Plaza Italia in Chile and in other places, including Colombia, yes, it was partly a response at a high level to the market-based model. You certainly hear that in the political discourse. At the end of the day, the kinds of things that were being focused on were a lack of competent delivery of services and, in many cases, unmet expectations. I see that particularly when I was at the Plaza Italia, and many folks there were middle class. It made me think that a lot of what was happening was middle class people who weren't seeing rises in their earnings because growth is at 2%. The costs of private school, which is the only alternative because the public school system is so poor, were rising. At the same time, you just found out that your parents weren't going to get as much of a payout from the private pension systems you were expecting. So they get caught in a squeeze, subsidizing both ways. And in general, there's a lack of confidence in the service provision of the state. Now crime is moved to the top of Chile's concerns. And we hear there, as in many other places, the popularity of the El Salvador model. So this is all, we're already talking here about crime and violence, but also the capacity of the state to do what the state is supposed to do. And it's one of the things that it's not doing particularly well. But it's also the case that crime and violence is partly a result of state failure, both in making social progress and enforcement. The sad thing is that Latin right now has very little fiscal space to invest in much of anything, and it has pretty weak capabilities in many areas to respond. Even in the countries which are most have the highest degree of institutionality, a lot of things, for instance, surveillance or even police capabilities, are not where you might expect them to be. But just looking here, you can see in these little blue lines, which are all below zero in the graph to the left, all that's saying is the primary deficits that are still, that's before paying interest on debt, are, we're underwater in almost all countries. And those little orange lines are the rise in interest payments that have occurred over the last years with the rise in interest rates. So the fiscal deficits are not going away very quickly, and nor is debt as a result. And you can see here that the little blue rectangles and to the right, this is where debt was in 2010, and then it zoomed up to the orange triangle in 2019 during the pandemic. And then, except for the case of Jamaica, it's pretty much stayed there or risen, which is to say that states are having a really hard time getting spending under control. And there's not a lot of room for anything. Crime and violence, infrastructure, education, innovation. We're in a tough space, and that means one of the agendas has to be that the state does much better what it does with what it has. And I want to talk about that. How much money should be directed to social versus, say, enforcement measures? There's a bit of both. It's pretty clear, but it's not really clear how much. I would say that from an economics point of view, it's pretty speculative. There is a relationship globally between homicide rates and income per capita, but not really in Latin America. You can see to the far left here, Latin America is way above what would be forecast given its level of income. And it's a little bit better with Gini's, who are especially in inequality. There is a relationship between inequality and crime, homicides. And again, homicides is a terrible measure of what we're trying to get at, but it's the measure we have consistent data on. But it's also the case that the key leverage, heavy leverage points, the ones that are defining this trend, are all lack. They're all the Colombias and Brazils of the world, which have high inequality and high rates of homicide. And if you just took them out and fitted the curve to the rest of the world and then put lack back in, we would all be far above the predicted value for inequality. Doesn't mean that inequality is not important. One study that Maloney and Suarez did in 2010, which testifies to how long we've been looking at this, they tried to decompose what's driving these differences in rates of crime across countries. And the rate of incarceration and police presence was important. That covered over 60% of the difference they saw. But the Gini was also around 30%, and then growth around 4% of that. So it's all there. We don't necessarily understand what these things are capturing, and that's a problem. For instance, we know that inequality is a strong regional component. Rural areas tend to be poorer, but it's also true that rural areas are further from the rule of law and further from central power. So they may be capturing something else besides inequality per se. That said, Claudia and Suarez and a couple others in 2012 found that the increase in transfers to family under Bolsa Familia in Brazil reduced crime by about 21% from 2006 to 2009, suggesting that in fact there is a family income component driving crime. The success stories in a more or less dramatic democratic context, and I'm just sort of piecing this together, these are the ones that always get mentioned. But just to take as a base case, the bottom, El Salvador, which we're not saying was democratic at all, we're just using it as a reference of what's considered achievable. El Salvador, with the huge lockdown that Haley implemented, went from 103 to 2 homicides per 100,000 people from 2015 to 2023, which is a very large number. But it's also impressive that Bogota went from 80, which is not so far, from 103 to 13, from 93 to 2022 under Mocos and Peñalosa. And Guatemala, and Sao Paulo less, 46 and 52, but both of them had substantially large falls as well. And what they engineered was some combination of better information systems for tracking crime and geolocating crime, increased policing, dry laws. And Claudia can explain what the ley zanahoria is. I don't know how that fits in. But in any case, it turns out that a lot of homicides are committed in the wee hours of the morning when people are drunk. So cutting off alcohol has a positive impact. Various different weapons programs, either voluntary surrender or others, were important. And then there were a variety of different kinds of social programs, ranging from psychological services to youth at risk services, and then the general recovery of public spaces. All of this seemed to work pretty well for engineering, particularly in Bogota and Sao Paulo. So that's all key. But on the other hand, there's no way around the stronger enforcement. And we can see that what happened in Sao Paulo was that there's no direct correlation here, but as criminal homicides fell, the number of prisoners rose dramatically. Obviously, the optimal combination of these different elements is going to depend on the magnitude of the problem. If you're starting from El Salvador, it may be that you need a greater enforcement effort at the beginning than you did, say, in Guatemala. But the other thing that's going to matter is the type of violence. Common violence, okay, you can cut off alcohol and people are going to stop getting drunk at 3 a.m. and killing each other. That's true. Gang violence is a different animal, but again, if you arrest the gang leaders, that can take you a long way to where you want to go. Organized crime is a completely different animal, and it requires a completely different set of interventions and skills. But all three of these, to some degree, require a more capable state to respond, particularly in the last phase. So it's a major priority. So in the second half of what I'm talking about, I want to talk about how we've been thinking about building state capacity. It's kind of the sine qua non for everything that we want to do in development. We had an initiative called the Government Analytics Project, where what we sought to do is bring academic work on the measurement of government performance and evaluation of interventions to improve government performance and synthesize them for policymakers. And that's in this big blue mamotreto to the right. And then we're about to put out this Data for Better Governance for LAC, which is meant to make that bridge to policymakers, where we talk about how you can use existing data systems that we have in the region, and we have a lot of them, to build a global government analytics ecosystem that allows us to reflect on what we're doing, provide feedback, and learn from our initiatives. And both these things we're trying to roll out in the region as a way of using best practices that we're learning to improve the quality of governance. We've done this before. This is definitely possible. The LAC state has seen a tremendous gain in professionalism, for instance, in macroeconomic management in the last 30 years. We are not the volatile, hyperinflationary region that we were 30 or 40 years ago. Nobody thinks that. The markets don't think that. That was done through the professionalization and increasing independence of the major macroeconomic, the central bank and Ministerios de Hacienda. So we know we can do this, and we know that the potential returns to doing it elsewhere in government are very high. We estimate somewhere around, on average in the region, 4% of GDP could be saved through improvements in procurement, transfers, and human resource policy. And with 4%, it gives you some fiscal space. You can start doing stuff with that, because that's 12% of your budget right there. But this is an example. Procurement is key. About 15% of global GDP goes through procurement. And the potential gains through e-procurements, transparency portals, things like that have been documented to be high. Just to give one example, in Russia, raising the quality of the bottom 25% of procurement agents, the guys who are paying the highest amount for whatever, for widgets, and getting them up to the level of the average of the other 75%, saves 15% of total Russian healthcare spending. This is a huge, it's $10 billion. It's an enormous amount. And it's not controversial, right? It's not a major political economy problem in doing it, but there are lots of things we can do like that. Same thing, gains in digital delivery of services. We had a report on that a couple of years ago. Things like telemedicine, paying your taxes online, all sorts of things, renewing your license online. They're really liked by citizens, and they buy you a lot of popularity for not very much money. So, and in addition to building efficiency. So this is another dimension of where we could go. I also think that these set of tools can help us thinking through a non-paralyzing approach to corruption. What do I mean? As we all know, that corruption is a major barrier to execution of projects, and also raising funds for future resources. No one wants to spend money on a metro if they know that half the money is going to go in somebody's pocket. This is a larger issue of tax morale and how people feel relative to the state. If they feel the state is doing what it does well, then they feel better about it. At present, though, I don't think our system works. We have this system of draconian penalties for violating very uncertain rules, which just make people not want to do anything. The example I have is when I was working with Planeación Nacional in Colombia, we were wanting to contract the World Management Project, an international group out of MIT and Harvard, to evaluate the quality of Colombian management. And we wanted to contract them because it would be consistent. It would be the same people who are doing the evaluations of all countries. The Colombian law says if it can be done within the country, it should be done in the country. And so could we say that these people couldn't raise the survey? No, we're not saying that. Are we sure that it would be comparable? No. The person who had to sign the check waited 3 months to do it because if you signed it wrong, you could go to jail. So I think we have to think about alternative approaches to reducing corruption that don't do that, have that paralyzing feature. And we know that meritocratic appointments and promotion, any of you have seen Lincoln, know how he got the 13th Amendment through. It's like by giving away post office and stuff like that. We were a pretty corrupt and messy country in the Civil War, but it was precisely the slow evolution of a meritocracy and higher quality of bureaucrats that seemed to have made the difference eventually to get something decent as a civil service. Strategic pay increases for certain, not everybody, but for the right people can reduce corruption. An interesting economy in Nigeria appeared to lead to greater task completion and to some degree less corruption. Also, they found Rasul and Ragar. So there are things, I don't have the answer to this, but I think it's one of the things we need to think through because our present approach to corruption, I think, doesn't work. The same analytic approach can make inroads into crime. Just some examples about prisons, which is one dimension of things. Uruguay, when they doubled the cash that was given to people leaving the prison, just doubling it to $1.5 US dollars, it reduced first recidivism in property crimes to 0 from 25%. Simply, the guys didn't have to rob to get the cab home. Some stuff like that is cheap. It has an impact. Improved prison conditions in Colombia led to a 36% reduction in recidivism rates. Similar things have been found in the US. That's, of course, more expensive, but it's not controversial. It's not difficult from a political economy point of view. Electronic monitoring has been proved to be an effective alternative to prison in Argentina. I think we need to think a lot about optimal incarceration. I mean, in Colombia, there's evidence that unskilled offenders learn from skilled offenders. And I think El Salvador has a massive dynamic problem. If they're ever going to let these guys out of jail, they've created just some whole new generation of well-trained criminals. We know what prison gangs often run prisons and run outside life often as well. And so we have to be thinking about what would be the best form of incarceration. There are various different alternatives. Harder political economies, and this just to give one that's not crime related directly, but poor public education. This is LAC's most exclusionary institution, if you want to use the Nobel Prize winners terminology. You can see that learning proficiency by region, we're just second to sub-Saharan Africa and well below our competitors, for instance, for nearshoring in East Asia, Europe, and Central Asia. And if you look at how we are in terms of GDP per capita, we're those little yellow dots to the right. And we look at Vietnam, which is why we're leaving China. Now we're considering moving my company from Vietnam to Latin America. It's a pretty much of a slam dunk. Vietnam has achieved in one generation what Latin America has been unable to do in 50 years. This is something that is partly easy in the sense of not a major political economy problem. So again, we're talking about capabilities, and we've got a recent book out on how management in public schools can really improve the quality of test scores and all. Just professionalization of the bureaucracy, again, and more meritocratic systems help a lot. But we also won't be kidding ourselves. The political barriers to things like performance contracts, teacher evaluation, just ensuring attendance in the classroom are very hard. And we have to go through that somehow. And there are also hard challenges for crime and violence. It's a mix of technocratic fixes like the one we're talking about, but also political economy challenges. Like, for instance, prison reform, all that learning, bad learning that we're talking about, 43% of those incarcerated in the region not had trials. So we need justice reform, but that's a very hard thing to do. It's a weak, at least in the system, and it's weak, has a weak presence in parts of the countries, and it's very complicated. We're going to have to go through that. Policing reforms, huge training challenges, which is kind of easy. It's just a question of money and finding the right piece. But there are also issues of corruption and independence that we need to worry about. And then global collaboration. Much of what we're talking about with crime right now is organized crime. And it's not one or two cartels out of Colombia. It is Albanian cartels. It is Hezbollah. It is cartels from all over the world. And this cannot be solved without collaboration across countries and not only in the region, but also in Europe and the United States. And that's collaboration in information, collaboration in training, collaboration in enforcement. And that's going to be a very hard thing to orchestrate at this moment. Anyway, there's just some ideas I have. Thanks very much for your.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bill. Really insightful. And now we're gonna go into Hillel, maybe?
Sure. Sure.
Thank you.
Gotta share my screen. Sorry. So let me start as I'm pulling up my slides here by thanking Claudia and Paula for putting the series together and for including me in it. I feel like I should start with a thank you because by the end I'm not sure that anybody's going to want to listen to what I have to say. As Claudia said, I'm somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about state building, sort of very conceptually and theoretically in an abstract sense and historically. And so I'm not sure, like Bill, that I have any answers at all. I have fewer answers even than he did to offer, but maybe I want to suggest something about asking the right questions. Okay. So let me start, I think, by trying to narrow things a little bit and talking about how we define state building in contemporary, or how we define state building. So we have a definition we could take in contemporary Latin America. So I want to draw a somewhat narrower definition and define it not in terms of the professionalization of a bureaucracy or in terms of the capacity that exists at the center, but to focus on an aspect of state building that I think is important to scholars of Latin America, which is the effort of the state to increase the state's authority or its presence in a given place or a given portion of the national territory. And let me acknowledge at the start that this is, of course, a long-term challenge in Latin America. A lot of folks, including the next speaker and a lot of scholars in sociology and history and political science, have argued and shown that the state's authority or its presence has long been uneven and incomplete in the region. And if we want to kind of understand how we got to where we are today, then we need to focus on the historical roots of this contemporary problem. But we can't stop there. My contribution to this conversation, if there is one, would be completely useless if I just stopped there and focused on those historical roots. And so instead, I want to talk a little bit about what ways forward we might take. And I want to start by kind of thinking, the organizers sent us some questions to motivate or orient our comments. And one of them was sort of to think about the obstacles to state building. And I want to kind of start with a set of obstacles to state building that are the standard view, and then think about ways in which maybe we should shift our perspective from the standard view to a different set of questions. But I think it's still important to think for a moment about what some of these standard obstacles are. So the first standard obstacle to state building, and especially to state building in a democratic context, is well captured in a famous line from Max Weber's essay on the state, where he described politics as the strong and slow boring of hard boards. State building is hard work that unfolds over a long period of time, and any project that's going to focus on state building over a fairly long time period is going to, in the standard view, have to confront or overcome a set of obstacles that come from the fact that those time horizons are longer than the time horizons of democratic politicians. A second set of obstacles, which Bill nicely highlighted by showing us information about deficits and debt in Latin America, are that state building requires resources. A third challenge is the recruitment and retention of bureaucrats, and then related to that, kind of the design of the institutions in which those bureaucrats work to overcome delegation and agency problems. Perhaps an even bigger set of challenges to state building comes from the need to overcome the lack of compliance from society, or at least from sectors of society. There's a recent book that just came out by Agustina Paglayan, which argues that basically education historically in Latin America, and especially in Chile, was designed to make society compliant, that in the aftermath of civil wars, governments invest quite a bit in education as a way to sort of force society to shift its views away from those views that were in the opposition during the civil wars. And finally, scholars of state building in Latin America and more generally have started to focus quite a bit on this idea of legibility, which was developed by the late Jim Scott, and which focuses on the idea that in order to effectively implement policy, the state has to be able to understand society and the territory that it governs by collecting information about it. And what I want to highlight is that all of these perspectives together all of these obstacles together, we could think of as a set of challenges that the state has to overcome, has to have the will and capacity to overcome in order to impose its authority on society. But the organizers asked us to consider how we can overcome obstacles to state building in settings of high insecurity, high inequality, and high democratic discontent that characterize contemporary Latin America. And in thinking about these questions, it struck me that if we think about other instances of state building in the world, these could be early modern Europe, they could be places where state building succeeded in Latin America, 19th century Chile, for example, Mexico in the aftermath of revolution, that the first two of these conditions actually are present in a lot of those cases, that often state building efforts take place and sometimes succeed in settings of high insecurity and high inequality. And so it seems to me that the particularly interesting question to focus on for the purposes of our conversation today is the challenge of state building under democratic discontent. If we look at these historical experiences of successful state building, it's quite clear that there's quite a bit of discontent in those settings as well. We don't have the public opinion data like the data that Bill showed us, or data that many of us know about discontent in contemporary Latin America in these historical settings, but we have the historical record of rebellions against the state, rebellions against elites, and rebellions by elites against the state, which suggests that discontent is often present in settings where state building happens. And so I think I want to narrow my focus to explore the question of how state building can take place under democracy. And I want to suggest that in order to do that, we need to reframe the process of state building and reframe the obstacles a little bit, and to kind of recognize that a lot of what we think about as state building is not something that the state imposes on society, but something that the state provides. In the words of Didac Queralt, who wrote a great recent book on debt and state building, or the financing of debt and state building, he defined state building not in terms of the state's ability to impose, but in terms of the development of the capacity to carry out policies that deliver benefits and services to society. That's a very different way of thinking about state building, and it's one that's easy to think about when we think about social services or road building, electrification or infrastructure, when we think about the welfare state, when we think about education. But I want to suggest that rather than drawing a line between two phases of the state and thinking about the state that distributes or provides and the state that imposes, then instead, if we're interested in how to pursue state building under democracy, we need to find a way to think about the politics of state building or of all dimensions of state building from a perspective of provision of services. And I want to think about this in terms of security provision, which I take is a key focus of what this conversation today is supposed to be at. And so what I want to suggest is that the provision of security depends on creating conditions under which society will welcome not just the outcome of security, but its provision by the state, right? We can think about the provision of security as something which, and I gather other previous workshops in the series have talked about this, that the provision of security often takes place by non-state actors. We don't want to think about that as state building. Instead, what we're interested in is a setting in which, or kind of creating conditions by which the state is the one effectively providing security. And this provision perspective points out to us that effectiveness is a joint product of two factors. The first is the policy itself and its implementation, and the second is whether societal actors take up this policy or sort of, reject it, or whether they welcome it or take it on board. And so I want to suggest that the challenge of the democratic coercive state depends on two questions. The first is, what are the right policies, or what are the right institutions and the right policies? And the second is, under what conditions society will welcome and collaborate with these policies. Now, the state building literature has paid far more attention to the former, to getting the policies right and the institutions right, than to the latter. And so I want to focus a little bit on the latter and ask the question of what uptake by society looks like. And here, I think there's some reason to be pessimistic. I'm drawing here on a great recent article by Harvard's own wonderful Yanilda Gonzalez and her co-author Lindsay Micah, who looked at an institution of democratic security provision in Brazil, which are these community meetings between police officers and concerned citizens, right? It's participatory policing. And what they did is they have meeting minutes where they look at what concerned citizens express to police officers. What should the priorities of police officers be? And the striking thing they find is that in a huge share of these meetings, citizens participating in democratic institutions frame marginalized groups as security threats. And I recognize the slide here is probably too small for you to read, but what it shows is the share of these meetings in which particular groups were mentioned as security threats. So the big columns, which reach 65, 70%, are that basically teenagers and youth are mentioned as security threats in 2/3 of these meetings, and so are drug users, people experiencing homelessness in nearly half of meetings, and so on. There's a large share of these meetings in which democratic participation reflects and represents and asks the state to undertake policies that reflect illiberal values. And so if we're going to think about the provision of security by the state under democracy, we have to grapple with the fact that democratic participation can reflect illiberal values. And so I want to suggest that making state building both liberal and democratic is actually what we're concerned about, right? That we're concerned not just about participation or the reflection of public values, whatever those values might be, in state building, but that we're concerned instead with finding a way to make state building both liberal and democratic. And I don't have a lot in the way of answers here, but I want to suggest that there are two sets of challenges that we have to grapple with. The first set of challenges we have to grapple with are confronting an opposition that wants to win elections and that can leverage democratic institutions to challenge state building. So I think the time horizons piece of the story comes back in here. But the second set of challenges comes from the need to limit the influences of illiberal positions in society on policy outcomes without exclusion, right? How can we pursue democratic state building that's also liberal? So I think, unfortunately, I want to argue for a pessimism here, but I want to suggest that that pessimism derives from different reasons than have traditionally been studied by scholars of state building. Even if we don't have the answers to the challenges that I've tried to raise here, I think it's important to suggest that these, rather than or in addition to the imposition-based questions of getting the policies and institutions right, should perhaps be the issues we focused on. And on that pessimistic note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Amazing, Hillel. Do you see how your participation was so important to us? Because it's not only about thinking the policies, but the right questions. So thank you so much for your contribution. And last but not least, of course, a dear friend and a great scholar, Ken Eaton, who contribution to a more sort of contemporary state building through, for example, I'll say in Latin America, decentralization, political, fiscal, administrative, was such an attempt precisely of a state building. So that it works, what could be fixed or improved in Latin American decentralization nowadays to improve the provision of security and justice, Ken.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for the invitation to participate in this panel and also for the really terrific questions that you circulated in advance, which have really gotten me thinking in kind of new ways about some of these questions. So I've got some brief thoughts on I don't have slides. My apologies for not having slides. I'm going to kind of talk you through some of the answers that I've come up with to some of the questions that were circulated. And so some brief thoughts on this kind of first big picture question about state capacity. And then I want to focus in on kind of a third set of questions that Claudia circulated that are really in a more narrow way about remote regions, about parallel structures of authority, and about decentralization. But let me kind of start with some of the big picture thinking here, building on some of what Hillel just said. And so I think, the first question, about how to overcome obstacles to state capacity, I think is the most important question in comparative politics today, certainly Latin America. I'm teaching a senior seminar right now on states in the global South and exactly this question of kind of where state capacity comes from. And so, as I remind my students every week, and I think we always need to keep in mind, state capacity is just extremely hard to build. One of the hardest things to create. It takes time, decades, even centuries. We know this from the handful of really excellent books written in the last decade on state capacity, including Hillel's. And the kind of point that there are no shortcuts. So the bad news is there are no real shortcuts to state capacity, and even worse is the point that it can be quickly eroded. Even though it can take so long to accumulate, we know that islands of competence can really be submerged rather quickly. So I think you've asked us to think about a really hard question in an even harder context, this contemporary moment characterized by resurgent populism. And I think the first thing to do with scholars, and this kind of I think mirrors what Hillel said, is really to reject the state first view. So the view that state building should precede democracy, or that democracy could or should be put on the back burner so that the state could be built. I think we need to just kind of firmly reject it. There's a really wonderful and powerful empirical rejection of this hypothesis in the Element that Sebastian Mazuka and Jerry Monk just published on the middle quality institutional trap, which I encourage people to look at, where they indeed identify a series of co-evolution strategies to simultaneously build the state and democracy. So I think the first point is always to insist that there are indeed democratic ways to build the state. When I think about the kind of the overcoming obstacles part of this first question, I would say that lots of recent scholarship has given us, just since 2000, really, a much better sense of the multiple sources in which state capacity can emerge, and some of them are quite unlikely. And so a lot of the literature on state building is indeed heavily structural and historical. and it kind of doesn't lend itself all that well to perhaps actionable insights. But I think there are important exceptions, in terms of these unlikely sources. And just to name a few here, I'm think of Eduardo Moncada's work on business as a source of business partnerships with local government as a source of capacity. Jessica Rich has done important work on how the AIDS movement brought a lot of its capacity into the state in Brazil. There's a wonderful Swedish scholar, Maria Therese Gustafsson, who works on transnational kind of NGOs and how they help regional governments in Peru figure out how to zone, develop the capacity to do zoning in mining areas. So it's a scattershot kind of set of work, but I think the kind of one common walkaway is that we need to look far beyond the central state itself if we want a fuller understanding of how state capacity might increase, and kind of remove our blinders, our tendency to just kind of look within the central state itself. And that's the good news, maybe. The bad news is no shortcuts. The good news is lots of potential sites for capacity building. I want to talk about two possible sources outside the central state. The first is the subnational state, and the second refers to kind of non-state armed actors. And so this is my segue into the third set of questions that Claudia circulated. And I want to think about Colombia in particular to try to talk about these questions. And so this question, and for those of you who don't have it handy, asks, quote, how can governments enhance the operational capacity or presence of state institutions, particularly in remote regions where criminal groups have established parallel structures of authority and inclusion? So the first answer that I want to suggest is that we shouldn't think that the central government can just create capacity in the center and then just kind of pick it up and carry it from the center to the periphery. And here I want to draw your attention to the incredible, meticulous work that Claudia did in her 2016 book Adios a las FARC, where she devotes about a third of the book to this very careful analysis of how no less than 9 successive Colombian governments, beginning with Alberto Lleras Camargo in the 50s all the way up to 2010, failed over and over and over in their attempt to llevar el Estado a la periferia. It just doesn't work. And so this argument has had a really big impact on my thinking, not just because I think it helps us understand Colombia, but because it's a much bigger theoretical claim about state building and of the need to find much more organic ways of building state capacity that involve local governments on the one hand and maybe even local non-state armed or formally armed actors on the other. So I thought I could elaborate a little bit on this point by discussing the 2016 peace accord in Colombia, which is admirable in so many respects, but oddly silent and even dismissive of subnational governments. So I think this is odd because the concept of territorial peace, la paz territorial, is at the very heart of the peace accord. And yet the accord really denies meaningful roles to territorial governments, whether we're talking about the 1,100 municipalities in Colombia or the 32 departments. And so elsewhere, I've tried to argue that both the FARC and the government negotiators in Havana learned different but similarly really negative lessons about local governments, which again are striking for their absence in the accord. So the accord really endorses sectoral deconcentration, the notion that the ministries of the central government are going to be deployed into the marginalized regions, and rejects territorial decentralization really in all 6 of its chapters. So whether we're talking about the chapter on rural reform and the need for public investment, how the FARC is going to transform into a party, possible solutions to illicit drugs, subnational governments are sort of nowhere to be seen really. And everything depends on kind of the bureaucracy of the central government. So I think this is problematic. Many factors have kind of hindered the success of the accord, but some of the blame I think should be attributed to the decision explicitly to kind of ignore subnational governments. And I think the point I want to make is that we can remain very clear-eyed about the many deficits of subnational governments, all of their failings, without imagining territorial peace could be possible without territorial governments, not just in Colombia, but virtually anywhere. If for no other reason, and I think Colombia under Duque really shows this well, this highly centralized approach to state building is exceedingly risky because it depends so greatly on who wins at the national level. So the Colombian case and then the peace accord, I think there's a real irony here, which is that Colombia wholeheartedly embraced decentralization in the 80s and 90s when the central state's coercive capacity was quite weak, which really increased the riskiness of decentralization. And then, in the 2010s, when the central state had kind of recovered its coercive capacity, it eschews decentralization and really downgrades and kind of ignores subnational governments. Okay, so that's my bit on sort of subnational governments as players here. In addition to suggesting that the state's presence cannot be enhanced without the role of subnational governments, which is maybe not controversial, even though it was indeed rejected by the negotiators of the accord. I think another way to think about the question Claudia is posing, and this is more controversial, is sort of wonder about the incorporation into the state of the parallel structures that were built by criminal groups. And I think the central claim here I want to make would be that more organic forms of state building from the ground up are likely to involve not just local governments, but indeed these non-state armed or formerly armed actors. And here too, I think that the 2016 accord is really instructive, and that there were perhaps really missed opportunities with, again, huge respect to the negotiators and an appreciation for how vexing this question is. But my take on the negotiations is that on the government side, there was tremendous resistance to the idea of using or leveraging or taking advantage of the FARC's ability to create parallel and informal institutions, especially in the twin areas of justice and security. So in the 200 or so municipalities that had really strong FARC presence, building capacity locally would have required validating the FARC as a quasi-governing actor. Santos and his team, I think, wanted to avoid this approach, in part due to the kind of constant battle they faced on their right flank from Uribe and others who refused to kind of countenance the idea that the FARC's capacities could be integrated into the state. To be fair, the FARC didn't help matters by constantly pushing for an entirely new institutional architecture that would create special territories to construct peace and where they were dominant in replacement of the municipal structure of government, which really strengthened fears that they would use these spaces to carve up the state from within. Moving beyond Colombia, and thinking more generally about the literature on peace building and post-conflict reconstruction, I think maybe one point to make would be peace accords differ dramatically precisely on this question of whether and how to integrate into the state the capacity that non-state actors might bring. So I don't think I think the jury's out. I think clearly in the Colombian case, the decision was made to not take advantage of those kind of organizational structures. But more generally, I think we can identify many peace accords that make very different decisions about this question. Okay, so that's the kind of the first part of this question, and then this third question has this really intriguing secondary question embedded in it that I've mulled over and that I want to think about, and this is about how theories of democratic transition might apply to this dynamic. And I've never thought of it in this way, and so I really appreciated this invitation to kind of think about that literature, which I teach every year, the literature on transition democracy, but I haven't really thought about it in this context. And so one thought was, and I'm curious what others might think here, but the notion of a pacted transition might be useful. So using this analogy of a democratic transition where the criminal groups are the functional equivalent of the kind of outgoing authoritarian regime, one could argue that a transition by collapse is superior to a transition by transaction. So in other words, much better that the criminal groups be defeated by the state than bargained with, but that the latter dynamic, again, transition by transaction or a pacted transition, could perhaps facilitate the incorporation or integration of non-state structures into the state in a positive way. And then in keeping with this analogy, the hope would be over time that the non-democratic elements of the pact that might make many of us uncomfortable could be overcome through democratic politics. But anyway, I'd be interested in hearing kind of more generally how theories of democratic transition might apply. And then the last part of this question has to do with decentralization, which I've already mentioned a little bit, but I just wanted to say a few more things, again, with the Colombian case in mind. And these are a little bit more with the Colombian case in mind and with remote regions, the rural settings in mind, and these are a little bit more fragmented. So the first thing that I wanted to say here is really to echo another point Claudia makes in Adios a las FARC, which she wrote as a critique of the Colombian case, but which does apply more generally. And this is the point that the almost exclusive focus of the decentralization agenda was on social provision rather than security. And I think this is more generally true in not just Colombia, but in Latin America, and even in federal countries that have subnational police forces. So in other words, so those who would say, well, we tried decentralization, it didn't work, one could respond that, the tremendous enthusiasm for decentralizing reforms really skipped over the security sector. So lots of change in health, education, infrastructure, lots of fiscal decentralization, but precious little, in terms of internal security. And I think the point here would be that local governments indeed can and should play more robust roles vis-a-vis security, even if the only police force is national, which is the case in unitary countries. I think one special Colombian problem is that the national police remains under the Ministry of Defense rather than the Ministry of Interior, which is now such an outlier in Latin America. The Interior Ministry would be a much more obvious and likely partner for local governments. Earlier this year, I was working with a Colombian think tank, Ideas para la Paz, which has tried to include security issues in the decentralization agenda of the Petro government with no success, really. And so this fall, Colombia is debating reforms that would restore kind of more generous fiscal transfers, kind of returning to the 91 Constitution in a way, but really kicking down the road this critical question of competencies and responsibilities, including potentially security. The second kind of thing to say about decentralization that I wanted to mention, because it's so important in remote regions, the ones impacted by the conflict, is the question of royalties from extractive industry, so regalias. The bigger question here is, how can the sharing of royalties from extraction improve local security? And Colombia's tried a variety of approaches. So the 91 Constitution radically decentralized, but only to producer regions, these royalties, which led to a lot of inequality and kind of inferior projects. A lot of questions about the quality of, the spending that was happening locally. 20 years later, in 2011, Colombia re-centralized its control over regalias, and then 4 years ago, kind of reverses that again, and kind of re-decentralized these royalties. And so, but I think this is important and kind of fascinating, because this issue really illustrates this conundrum, which is at the center of this question, which is the reality of deficient state capacity at the local level, but also the tendency of the center to use those deficiencies as a pretext to re-centralize. It's a thorny and sticky, and the regalias are a great window onto that. The last thing that I want to do is kind of zoom out from the municipal level, not to the center, but to the intermediate level, and to think about the kind of the special role of governors in the security sector. And so in Colombia, governors are technically, agents of the president in terms of maintaining order, but they play an extremely limited role in security matters, and they're very poorly integrated into decision-making structures in defense, the Ministry of Defense at the national level. But this seems problematic. The absence of governors seems especially problematic in these remote regions in which you have multiple municipal governments with common security challenges, but who are not coordinating. The governors would be the one, not the center, but the governors would be the ones to logically play that kind of coordinating role. They don't coordinate with one another, and they're not kind of coordinating within their regions. And so the same think tank, Ideas para la Paz, they've generated some interesting proposals about, in a non-federal but quasi-federal system, which is what Colombia is, like how to beef up the kind of the missing actor here, which are governors, not just mayors and not just, the national government, but governors at that intermediate level. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, what a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And now we're going to take some questions and try to keep the discussion forward. So somebody has 1, 2. Let's start with these 2.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everyone, for giving us the opportunity to listen to you. My name is Santiago Cregueras. I'm a fellow here. And, this is a question for everyone, which I usually struggle with. Are we actually talking about lack of capacity, or mostly talking about lack of capability for actually reaching level of security in
What do you mean by the difference?
The capacity, I guess, is more about the resources that you have, and the capability is about the ability of the people working within the organizations that are in charge of doing this, of really pursuing and managing to get a good result in terms of what they are doing. For example, I could say that in my country, in Mexico, we have a huge capacity in terms of resources. I would say we have like a C4, C5 center with state-of-the-art resources that are, have cameras that are all over the place and so on and so forth. But I could tell you that at some point in time, there was a moment in which I was passing by the office of the president's office, Los Pinos, which many of you might have seen. And it's usually an area which is meant to be surrounded by Secret Service. And one of, if you Google this area in the internet, is one of the areas in which you have the greatest number of assaulted people every day. And you have the cameras there, and when you meet people who have been assaulted, it seems to be that the cameras didn't work that day.
I understand. Thank you. Second question here.
Hi, thank you to all the panelists. So my question is for Professor Eaton, and it's on this final point on building territorial capacity for the provision of security. So my question is, like, how can we balance that objective, which seems very reasonable, with these concerns that these places that are farther away from the center might also be more prone to capture by elites or by non-state armed actors that might even infiltrate this process of institutional design to perpetuate their interests through institutional means. So how can we balance building security and capacity for security at the local level, but also avoid capture by these non-democratic forces?
You want to go with that first, and then we can pick up another couple of questions, maybe? Ken, do you want to start to address
Sure.
that?
Yeah. I can both. Just that, it's a great first question. And it makes me realize I don't tend to think of this as a money problem, notwithstanding, Bill's chart kind of showing in this current moment right now that kind of the fiscal accounts are not positive. I tend to think the money is less of the problem than kind of these political incentives and other kind of obstacles that get in the way of the effective use of the money that actually is there. And so, if you think about the regalias that I just mentioned, the canon minero in Peru, money is not the problem. It's the kind of the inability of particularly local governments to have the capacity to design projects that are effective and that are going to actually target local problems. But that's a capacity versus capability. I tend to think of it less as a fiscal capacity problem than other. Obviously, that varies country to country. And then thank you for this question about kind of what to do in context of elite capture and in the presence of non-state armed actors. And so maybe just two things to say would be, and one of the tricky things about decentralization is, the national government doesn't go away. It just has to play a different set of roles, and it has to play them really well. And so, when you're not directly providing services yourself, then kind of the supervision and oversight roles, the accountability, all of those kind of roles become ever more important, and to ensure that resources aren't being deployed in violent ways at the local level. Only the national government, potentially the governors, could at an intermediate level play some of that oversight role. So I think one would be kind of supervision, oversight, those policy attributes of the national government that become even more critical in the wake of decentralization. And that's kind of an across the board answer. And then another way to think about this would be, and there's probably been too little of this in Latin America. It seems to be more common in kind of other parts of the world, but thinking about asymmetry. And so not a uniform treatment of subnational governments, but rather taking stock of which subnational governments are in a position, potentially because non-state armed actors are less significant, are ready and able to receive some of those resources, but not to kind of treat in a uniform cookie cutter, one size fits all, decentralizing to the same level across the country, but rather a kind of a more hard note. It's politically can be more challenging because then you have to defend which regions are getting the special treatment and which aren't. But if we kind of think about asymmetric federalism, the impulse there is to not treat all territories equally and to make fine-grained and informed judgments about what the local terrain is, whether it might justify more decentralization or less. So I think kind of oversight and then asymmetry are maybe two ways to think about your really nice question.
Either Bill or Hillel want to make some comment about the questions?
I guess I'm a little bit less sanguine about, well, I fully agree with the argument that resources are often not well used. And I hope that came through as part of the point that I think we could do much better on. We have both problems of resources and we have problems of excellence and the capabilities of the people occupying our ministries. Even at the federal level in countries, it's really lumpy. You have some places where you have top-notch people and they're functioning super well, and then you have other places that aren't, right? And so, I mean, obviously just throwing more money at those, at the not functioning well ministries or whatever is not going to help. But it's also, it's also true there's a, if you just look, for instance, at resources dedicated to innovation, Regaliz is a perfect example of things not being used well for that purpose. But just in general across the region, all forms of support to firm upgrading and to innovation are way underfunded compared to other regions. So, I mean, we're short on money, but we're also short on capacity. And when I look at subnational governments, we really can't. I mean, we're really talking about municipalities and we're not talking about Medellin, we're not talking about Cali, we're talking about much smaller units. And it's really hard to bring them along. The human capital gravitates to the centers that, you have a good life. So I was in Peru a couple months ago and they say, hey, we have to decentralize. Yet it's very clear when you go to the regions, it's going to be hard to divest as much power as they want to the regions. On the other hand, the center isn't paying enough attention to the regions. Often you'll go to the region and they say, I don't know, we feel really far from the capital. So we need to divest more because the center can't do it, but we really can't do that until we have the human capital there.
No.
I mean, I think both of these perspectives are right. I guess just to highlight the common ground here, that the issue is both one of the inputs to the state, right? The sort of, in a broad sense, the resources the state has, not just fiscal, but in terms of human capital that the state has, and also a question of the allocation of those resources and the policies that one seeks to implement with those resources. But then the third concern, which is the one I tried to highlight, is sort of the one of uptake by society, right? I think we shouldn't assume that state building in the way that we in this room want to think about it is necessarily state building in the same way that citizens in rural Colombia want to think about it, right? And I think figuring out how to cross that bridge, or sort of grappling with that disconnect there, is a third set of constraints on state building that we need to think about.
Some other questions here? Well, let me jump with a sort of a comment on a question then. I guess one of the things that I want to ask is, of course, in Latin America, Colombia might be an extreme case because we still have this extreme, very differential presence of the state of democracy types across the territory, still have a sort of almost the legacy, if not still some going on civil war going on. But anyway, across Latin America, you're going to have these very differential territories and populations based on inequality, quality of democracy, and quality of a state. So we pretend to be unitary states. If you read the first article of Colombian Constitution, will tell you Colombia is an legal, democratic, national, unitary state, decentralized. But in my opinion, it should say not only decentralized, but differentiated. We cannot pretend to have such a variance across territory and not design a tailor-made variance across institutional design. Because one type or one size or one type of institutions cannot fit all. We cannot treat Tumaco the way we treat Medellin. So if we acknowledge that difference, which is huge, not only in Colombia, but that's the case in Peru, that's the case in Brazil. I mean, go everywhere. Maybe the difference is not how differentiated is population institution across territory, but how many and how strong competitors the state has. So the competitors that the state has in Colombia is not the same quantity and quality and pervasiveness of state competitors that Argentina has or Chile has. So the difference is who are we facing in that territory as a clearly a state competitor. And that should be included in the differential design that we do. If we send more money to Arauca today, the ELN is going to capture all that money. Every penny that we send them is going to be captured by the ELN. So it sounds like it's stupid to send more money there. And that was exactly the same challenge previously, let's say, in regions that were taken over by paramilitary groups, but regions where previously were taken over by the FARC was the opposite case. The FARC expelled over all the institutions. They just expelled them out of the territory and sort of replaced them with this informal, more community-based type of institutions. My point with all this introduction, I'm of course posing the case of Colombia that I know the best, but also could be sort of the most extreme, along with Mexico, on the type of the strength of the state competitors that we are facing in the territory. But my point is, either from the economic fiscal point of view, Bill, or from the state building and democratic design, because I think we are all agreed with the issue that democratic building and state building go hand in hand. There is no preceding order there. What will be, or in the new wave of decentralization, based in what we know after 4 years of decentralization of Latin America, from any of those perspectives, what would you recommend as the ingredients to take into account for a differential state building, state capacity strength and design across territory in Latin America? What would be the incentives, the best incentives to provide who actually are willing to be state builders? Let's say, we politicians, if I put my hat of politician, we don't have such huge incentives to be state builders. It's incredibly risky, it's incredibly costly, and it's super long-term. But let's suppose for a minute that some of us have such an incentive. What type of institutional design will prove better? From the fiscal point of view, or the democratic point of view, or the decentralization point of view? Take your time.
We need the Jeopardy music playing so we can think of an answer.
Oh my God.
I mean, if I could say one thing, I think that first of all, the historical record of state building is often not about the implementation of consistent policies everywhere across the national territory, but about these sort of targeted efforts, right? If we think about, an experience that was successful in the short run, even if it was then undermined, of Reconstruction in the United States, right? It was very much this project of inserting the northern state into the South after the Civil War to undo power structures there and sort of transform the state in that region, right? And so I think we have a lot of instances in the historical record of state building efforts that target particular places and particular regions. But I think the second thing I would say is that I think you know, maybe this is what you intended for us to assume away, but I think that the democratic politics of doing that are very complicated, right? Because I think saying we're going to focus on this particular region, you know, focuses resources on that region, and it may, depending on how this state building project is viewed, it may increase challenges that one faces within that region, right? The more challenges there are there, depending on how we deal with Ken's question of should these people be incorporated or not. And so I think we shouldn't assume away the democratic challenges of like, let's target our policies to this particular region, right? There's some serious challenges for a democratic politician in doing that. And we see that to some extent in contemporary Mexico, I would say.
Well, from the fiscal point of view, Bill, I don't know. Now that you have, I don't know if you have heard recently the debate about the new sort of fiscal decentralization that is being proposed in Colombia, trying to increase from 21% of the national income to 39% of the national income to be distributed in the next 12 years to municipalities. Yet we know precisely for the mission of decentralization that half of those municipalities have been wasting the money we send them in the last 4 years. And without no reform of that, we're gonna double down. Send them twice as money as before, hoping that this time they're gonna do it better. What to say about that?
Yeah, I suspect you understand the process pretty well. One thing that the last report we put out on was how it's actually in our interest to reduce what we call vertical fiscal imbalance, which is where municipalities or subnational governments receive a large share of the resources from the central government. And the reason is exactly what you say. When it's manna from heaven dropping in your lap, you treat it differently than if you just had to raise it off of local property taxes, which is what we've been advocating. And you know, you look at the United States, and it raises a huge amount of its overall revenues from local property taxes going to local schools, so people make that connection about how well their money is used as opposed to having it drop on them. So I tend to, while I tend to believe that in general decisions are made better, made closer to the problem, if you don't have a good system for handling those fiscal resources that are being transferred, and you don't have the human capital there. Or to get back to the earlier question, which I'm not sure we did justice to, how do you ensure that the people who, you know, are running the place aren't the ones who are already running the place? You know what I mean? Again, it's the people with high levels of human capital, broadly construed, who are the rich people in these regions, who are going to wind up with the poor and a lot of directing these resources. So I'm not really sure how we get around that, but I guess I'm in favor of reducing vertical imbalances and therefore raising more locally, and reducing dependence on the center and raising capacity at the same time.
Yeah, we need that advice to be passed along to the current national government in Colombia. and
So Claudia, yeah, Claudia, because I think this is a really interesting question. Like, what we need is differentiated governance, not uniform government. And again, zooming out from Latin America a little bit, like, so the best current index of how much authority regions have, the Regional Authority Index, which is this wonderful project of the last decade, tracking and measuring how much authority every country in the world gives to these intermediate regional level. A trend in the whole world, except not in Latin America, is indeed differentiated governance. Like, increasingly, we're seeing the explicit and formalized differentiated, and it's largely defensible and explained as a result of ethnic cleavages within countries. Like, this is kind of holding together federalism. You kind of have to let that region get something special to, you know, and it's again, it's missing from the Latin American dynamic in ways that are really fascinating. Maybe it's just because, you know, all these tensions don't track onto the concentration of ethnic groups into sub-units. But I think that doesn't mean that we don't need to find a way to precisely do what you're suggesting, which is, on what basis can we democratically defend differentiation? And so I think this, you know, Latin America is such an outlier, and maybe we need to look to other parts of the world for ideas about how to kind of do what you're suggesting we need to do. You know, but I also think, you know, earmarking, auditing, measures of how much coercive control does the state have over a locality. Like, I think there are even though I was very critical of the exclusively deconcentration approach in the peace accord, mixing the two, deconcentration into certain regions and decentralization in others, like, I think there are kind of ideas that could be combined, but I think you put your finger on like a real challenge, like differentiated governance, how to do it democratically.
Yeah. Some other question here, or sorry, there are some online. We have some online, so yeah, one of the questions here, Miguel Samper from Colombia has a question of how to achieve decentralization without or preventing corruption. We don't want the central government to use the corruption as an excuse for centralization, but we can not only simply dismiss the fact that there is a lot of not only corruption, but literally authoritarian co-optation of the local governments in many places, not only in Colombia, but also in Argentina and other places. So what could be the good balance, or what controls or institutional decides to take there into account?
I have a quick question, but first, thanks for this fantastic panel. My question is a little bit about El Salvador. And I was curious to see if we have any counterfactual. If you look at the historical records, do we see any instances of high public approval rates upon liberal strategies to provide security instead of illiberal? And if we can find any hope where high public approval rates can come from liberal strategies.
Well, I hope we find at least one. So for the two questions, Hillel and Kenneth and Will.
You go first, Hillel. I'm still thinking.
Yeah, my initial reaction as someone who lived in Philadelphia for 15 years was, that kind of overwhelming support for the election of a district attorney who took an explicitly at the city level, who took an explicitly less coercive approach to policing in the city, as an example. But I think the deterioration of support for that and other leaders or other policymakers who've taken those sorts of positions over time suggests that there's not a lot of experiences of sort of sustained support for this sort of democratic policing to point to. That's a pretty sobering perspective. I think, it would be interesting to sort of identify some of the moments where more in Latin America that we would point to as instances of the kind of policing you have in mind, and systematically look and see what public opinion looked like and how it evolved over time. The fact that I can't think of any studies that have done that sort of thing is suggestive.
Yes,
Yeah, no, you ahead, Bill.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's going to sound a little glib maybe, and I don't mean it in this way, but just that if, the reality of corruption at multiple levels of government suggests that we shouldn't think of decentralization or re-centralization kind of through that lens. In the sense that both levels kind of use it to argue against the institutional scenario they don't like. I think that's not, because otherwise I think the answer is just beefing up what I said earlier, beefing up oversight and supervision, mechanisms of accountability and auditing. Bill?
So I think we're probably on the same page, but I mean, it definitely has to be in the mix. I mean, within Colombia, you clearly hear people reluctant to transfer money to some regions because they know where it's going to go. I mean, so politically, this can't be moved off the table. I guess the question is, can we find mechanisms? And maybe in Brazil, we have an example where The bank actually works on strengthening local capacity and improving monitoring apparatuses and stuff like that. And the federal government actually is paying for that, because it's just a way of improving the quality of governance and reducing corruption. I think it has to be part of the debate. Absolutely. On the second question, I forgot your name, pero bom te ver. But I think there's this kind of default in the region, I feel, that, oh my God, crime is going through the roof. The only option is Bukele. And you hear it. And I think what I was trying to do with the not original selection of Bogota, Sao Paulo, and Guatemala was to show, they've actually done almost as well in Bogota, also in Medellin and Cali, fighting crime without throwing masses of people in jail without trial. So I think we have to make those, call them success stories, that are known, and just I think that's part of what this session was about. Do we have to throw in the towel on democracy, or can we? And I think the answer is there are options. They require a lot of state capacity to do, but people have done them. Colombia's been working on this for 20, 30 years now. So we just have to make that more of an option that people see as viable.
Great. Well, really, thank you so much. A huge round of applause for our panelists today. It's been such a great debate for this. I know it's a tough debate. We all wish we had the answers, but we will keep looking them. So thank you so much for everyone, and keep tuned. We will announce soon the fifth and last session of this seminar series about justice provision across territory. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Claudia.
Thank you.
Great.